Hello.
When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart skipped, not from fear of being caught, but because I knew he'd see those messages. The ones I had forgotten to delete. I reached out to grab the phone from his hands, but he pulled back sharply and kept reading. I stared at his face as it shifted with every line, feeling like my world was crumbling in seconds. Yes, he would find out the truth. But not the whole truth. His hands trembled slightly as he kept swiping, and I knew he was close to that message, the one that would destroy everything. The one that would explain, and at the same time, confuse everything even more. Suddenly, my phone vibrated in his hand, and a new notification lit up the screen. I saw the color drain from his face as he read the sender's name. He froze. Didn't even blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, an old habit when I'm nervous. My nerves tangled with the horror of realizing what I'd done. His breathing quickened, and I could hear it from across the room. This was what I had feared most. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake. A mistake that changed absolutely everything. And now, I don't know what to do, but let me tell you how it really happened. Before I share the secret I tried so hard to hide, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and answer this: have you ever had a secret you tried desperately to keep, but in the end, couldn't? The day my car broke down felt like the beginning of something small, something that seemed unimportant, but it ended up tearing my world apart. I had been driving home from visiting an old friend, taking the back roads instead of the highway, because I thought a quiet drive through the countryside would clear my head. My marriage had been steady, I guess that's the word. Safe. Predictable. My husband wasn't a bad man. He worked hard, paid the bills, never raised his voice at me. But somewhere along the way, the closeness we used to have disappeared, like a photo that's been left too long in the sun. I was thinking about that when the car shuddered, coughed, and died on an empty stretch of road. At first, I thought it would start right back up. I turned the key again and again, but nothing. The silence that followed was heavy, almost mocking. The dashboard lights blinked, and then even they went out. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the rain starting to spatter across the windshield. I reached for my phone. 10% battery. Of course. I could have called roadside assistance, but the thought of waiting hours out here made my stomach sink. My husband was away on a work trip, and the idea of calling him, explaining that I'd broken down, felt pointless. He couldn't do anything from miles away. And then, almost without thinking, I scrolled to another number. My nephew. He lived close enough. He knew about cars. He was someone I trusted, or maybe, if I'm honest, someone whose voice I wanted to hear. I pressed call. Hey, I said, trying to sound calm. My car just died on me. I'm out near the old mill road. I'll come, he said, like it was nothing. No hesitation. I ended the call and sat back, watching the rain thicken, the drops racing each other down the glass. It wasn't long, maybe 20 minutes, before I saw his truck pull up behind me. The headlights lit up my rearview mirror, and for some reason, my pulse quickened. He climbed out, pulling his hood up, the rain soaking his jacket almost immediately. You okay? He asked when he reached my window. I'm fine, I said, though my voice was a little too quick. He popped the hood, his hands moving with an ease I couldn't help but notice. There's something about someone who knows exactly what they're doing, and for a moment, I just watched him work. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead, his breath visible in the cool evening air. I think it's the battery, he said after a few minutes. Got jumper cables in the truck. I nodded, though I wasn't really listening. I was too aware of how quiet the road was, how close we were standing, how strange it felt to have someone, anyone, come for me like this. The car sputtered back to life after he hooked it up. The sound of the engine felt like relief, but also something else. A shift. Like the first crack in a wall you thought was solid. "Thanks," I said, my voice softer than I intended. He shrugged. "No big deal." But his eyes lingered on mine for a second longer than they needed to. The rain had stopped by then, leaving the world damp and smelling of wet earth. I sat behind the wheel, but I didn't start driving. "You want to come by for tea?" The words were out before I'd thought them through. "You're soaked, anyway." He looked surprised, then nodded. "Sure. Just for a bit." I should have driven straight home. Should have thanked him and left it at that. But as I followed him back down the road, headlights reflecting off the slick pavement, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a kind of anticipation. By the time we reached my house, the clouds had started to break. The porch light spilled over the driveway, soft and familiar. I parked and sat for a second, hand on the keys, feeling the weight of something invisible pressing down on me. He walked up the steps ahead of me, shaking water from his jacket. When I unlocked the door and we stepped inside, the house felt different. Warmer. Quieter. I hung up his jacket, fetched a towel. "You must be freezing," I said, and he smiled. That smile, it was just a thank you, but it caught me off guard. I made tea, set the cups on the table, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was just filling the silence. Looking back now, I wonder if that was the exact moment it all began. Not when the car broke down. Not even when he pulled up behind me on that dark road. But when I heard myself say, "Do you want to come in?" and didn't take the words back. The kettle had barely cooled by the time he finished his tea, and I could already feel the walls of my house absorbing the presence of someone who hadn't crossed the threshold in years. My nephew sat across from me, a little damp still, the towel I had given him folded neatly on the back of his chair. The table between us was covered with small details of my life, a half-finished crossword, a chipped mug I never throw out, a candle that hadn't been lit in months. We didn't talk much at first. It wasn't awkward, not really. It was the kind of silence that fills a room when there are too many things left unspoken. I caught myself studying him, the way he leaned forward slightly when he listened, the way his fingers tapped the mug absent-mindedly. And I thought, almost guiltily, how rare it felt for someone to sit with me like this. I've always been the one who holds everything together. That's what you do when you've been married for decades. You keep the house running, you keep things steady, you hold on to the structure even when you feel cracks beneath it. My husband doesn't see the cracks anymore. Or maybe he just assumes they don't matter. When he leaves for work trips, he kisses my cheek like someone signing a receipt. Functional. Necessary. And that's it. I brought out a plate of fruit and biscuits, and he smiled, almost shyly. "You didn't have to," he said, but took one anyway. "I know," I answered, sitting back down. "But I wanted to." It should have been such an ordinary moment, but it wasn't. The room felt too warm, and I couldn't tell if it was because of the tea, or the way his presence seemed to press on me in ways I didn't expect. We talked a little about the car. He explained what might have caused it to die, how I should check the battery soon. But the conversation drifted quickly, like a boat untying from its mooring. He asked how I'd been. I almost laughed at the question. How often does anyone ask me that and mean it? I told him I'd been busy, though I couldn't think of with what. I told him the garden needed work, that my husband was away again. He nodded, then said something simple, but it stuck with me. "It must get quiet here." It was such a harmless comment, but it landed heavier than he probably intended. Because yes, it does get quiet. Too quiet. Sometimes the house feels like a museum of a life that isn't really lived anymore. I didn't answer right away. I think he saw something in my face, because his expression softened. You've always been the one everyone counts on, he said. But who do you count on? The question caught me off guard. I looked away, at the steam curling from my cup, at the raindrops sliding down the window outside. I don't remember what I said back. Something vague, something that didn't give anything away. But inside, I felt something shift, something I couldn't name yet. He helped me clear the table, rinsing cups in the sink like he belonged there. I wanted to tell him to leave the dishes, but I didn't. Watching him move around my kitchen felt unsettlingly natural. When he reached for a plate from my hands, his fingers brushed mine. Just a light touch, nothing worth noticing, except that I noticed. My breath caught for a second, and I hated that it did. We stood there, too close, the clink of dishes in the sink the only sound between us. I should have said something. I should have stepped back. But I didn't. He dried his hands on a towel, and we walked to the door. It was late, the rain had stopped, but the night still smelled of it, damp and clean. He turned to leave, and for a moment, neither of us moved. There was that strange pause, the kind where time feels like it's waiting for you to decide which way it's going to break. And then, it happened. We didn't say a word. We didn't explain or justify. We didn't need to. We just leaned in, and we kissed. It wasn't long. It wasn't planned. But when we pulled back, I felt the weight of it drop into the space between us like a stone in water, ripples spreading out in every direction. He looked at me, something unreadable in his eyes. I looked at him, unable to find words. "Thank you for the tea," he said finally, his voice low. I nodded. "Thank you for coming." He stepped out into the night, and I closed the door behind him. I leaned against the wood, my hand flat against it, and listened to the sound of his truck starting, of him driving away. The house was silent again, but not the same kind of silent. This silence was full of the moment we'd just shared, full of the thoughts I couldn't push away. I went to the kitchen, rinsed the last cup, and set it upside down to dry. My hands were steady, but my heart wasn't. I walked to the living room, sat on the couch, and stared at nothing. I told myself it was a mistake. A single moment. Something to lock away and never revisit. But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't true. The kiss wasn't an end. It was the beginning of something I didn't yet understand, something I wasn't sure I wanted to. The morning after the kiss felt like standing in a room where someone had just shouted, and now everything was unnaturally still, waiting for the echo to fade. I woke up earlier than usual, as if my body refused to let me rest. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the familiar, comfortable quiet I had known for years. It was a new kind of silence, one that pressed against my skin, reminding me of what had happened the night before. I stayed in bed for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment in my head. The way it had happened so suddenly, the way I hadn't even thought to stop it. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, just a fleeting, foolish lapse, the kind of mistake you can fold away in your memory and pretend never happened. But I couldn't. The kiss didn't feel like something you could simply erase. When I got up, I went straight to the kitchen, moving through the motions of making coffee, but my hands felt strangely clumsy. I poured water into the kettle, measured out the coffee grounds, and yet every step felt foreign, like I was performing someone else's routine. I caught sight of the mugs drying on the rack, the same ones we had used the night before, and my chest tightened. The phone buzzed on the counter, and for a moment, my heart jumped into my throat. I didn't even need to look at the screen to know who it might be. But when I did, it wasn't him. It was my husband. A simple message, "Good morning. Busy day ahead. Back in a few days." I stared at those words longer than necessary. I read them again and again, not because they said anything important, but because they didn't. They were the kind of messages he always sent, polite updates from a life that ran parallel to mine. They carried no warmth, no weight, just a quiet efficiency. I replied with something equally simple, and when I set the phone down, I felt a wave of guilt crash over me. My husband trusted me. He always had. And here I was, hiding something from him already, a secret that felt heavier with every breath. I went about my morning like I was moving underwater. I watered the plants, folded some laundry, wiped down the counter, all the little tasks that make up a life, but each one felt slightly off. I kept catching myself glancing at the window, wondering if I would see his truck pull up again. I kept listening for my phone, even when it didn't make a sound. By midday, the tension had settled into me like an ache. I didn't know whether I wanted to hear from him or not. Part of me hoped he wouldn't reach out, that he'd let what happened last night dissolve into the air and we could pretend it hadn't happened. But another part of me, a part one didn't want to admit to, waited for the vibration of the phone, for his name to appear on the screen. When the message finally came, my pulse stumbled. "You okay?" 2 words. Just 2, and yet they carried so much. I stared at the message, unsure how to respond. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I typed yes, deleted it, typed I'm fine, deleted that too. Eventually, I just put the phone down and walked away, as if distance would make the question go away. But it didn't. I busied myself with cleaning the living room, wiping down shelves that didn't need wiping, rearranging books that didn't need rearranging. My hands needed something to do, because my mind wouldn't stop circling back to the same thought, what now? By the afternoon, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I picked up the phone and typed out a short response. "I'm okay. Thanks." I almost didn't send it, but my thumb pressed the screen before I could stop myself. Almost immediately, the little dots appeared, those dots that mean someone is typing. "Good," he wrote back. "Then, I just wanted to check on you." There was nothing wrong with that sentence. Nothing dangerous in the words themselves. But I felt them sink into me anyway, felt the quiet care in them, and it left me more unsettled than if he'd said nothing at all. I didn't reply again. As the day went on, I found myself noticing things I hadn't paid attention to in years. The creak of the hallway floorboards. The way the light shifted through the curtains as the sun moved. The faint hum of the refrigerator. It was as if every sound, every shadow, was louder, sharper, because my thoughts had nowhere to rest. By evening, the guilt felt heavier. When my husband called, his voice was cheerful, distracted. He talked about the trip, about the meetings he'd been in, about the dinner he was heading to. I listened, murmured responses, and wondered if he could hear it in my voice, the fracture I was trying to hide. After the call, I stood in the kitchen, staring at the counter where the mugs had been that morning. The same mugs that had held tea the night before, the same mugs we had both touched. I told myself, again, that it was just one kiss. Just one. But even as I whispered it in my mind, I felt the truth pressing in. It didn't feel like the kind of kiss that stays alone. I went to bed that night with the weight of it pressing down on me, the darkness around me thick, my thoughts looping in circles I couldn't escape. The house was silent again. But it didn't feel like it used to. The next morning arrived with a sky the color of wet paper, the kind of pale gray that made the whole world feel muted. I moved through the house slowly, careful almost, as if making too much noise might draw attention to the thoughts I was trying to suppress. The kiss had been 2 days ago, but it still hovered over me like steam that wouldn't clear from a mirror. I busied myself with chores, folding laundry that had already been folded once, rearranging items in the pantry. I told myself I was keeping busy to stay productive, but the truth was simpler and far more unsettling. I was trying to outpace my own thoughts. Around mid-morning, the idea of going out slipped into my mind, quiet and harmless at first. Just to run errands, I told myself. Groceries, maybe a stop at the post office. Anything to break the heaviness of the house. When I grabbed my keys, I didn't notice until later that I'd chosen the same scarf I wore that night when the car had broken down. I wrapped it around my neck anyway, telling myself it didn't mean anything. The roads were mostly empty as I drove, and the windshield wipers squeaked across the glass in slow, rhythmic arcs. The world outside was damp, the trees slick from last night's rain, the air still holding that after-storm smell that feels like both cleansing and warning. I hadn't planned to stop anywhere but the grocery store, but as I passed the little cafe on the edge of town, the one with the faded green awning and the uneven sign, I felt an impulse so sudden it almost startled me. I pulled into the parking lot before I could think better of it. The cafe was half full, the kind of place that always felt a little sleepy no matter the hour. The bell above the door chimed when I stepped inside, and for a moment I thought about leaving. Just turning around, pretending I'd only come to look. But then I saw him. He was sitting near the window, his jacket draped over the back of the chair, a mug between his hands. He looked up when the bell rang, and when his eyes met mine, something in his face shifted, surprise first, then something softer. I told myself it was a coincidence. That he was just here, like anyone else might be. But the air between us didn't feel like coincidence. He stood slightly as I approached, pulling out the chair across from him like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You're here," he said, a simple statement. "I was running errands," I replied, though the words felt thin, almost flimsy. We sat there, the table between us small enough that I could see the steam curling from his coffee. The silence that settled wasn't awkward, exactly. It was the same heavy, meaningful silence I'd felt in my kitchen 2 nights ago, the kind that didn't need words to feel loud. We talked about safe things at first. The weather, his work, the battery on my car. But every topic felt like a curtain we were both pulling across something else. Every time his eyes met mine, I felt the tension press closer. And then, something shifted. I noticed a man at the next table over, sitting alone, his phone propped up on a stand as he scrolled. At first, I thought nothing of it, everyone looks at their phone in a cafe. But then I saw the angle of the camera, how it wasn't pointed directly at him. It was pointed toward us. I froze for a fraction of a second, unsure if I was imagining it. I told myself maybe he was just video chatting, maybe I was overthinking. But my heart sped up anyway, and I caught my nephew glance in the same direction, his jaw tightening just slightly. I shifted in my chair, blocking the view a little, and tried to keep my voice steady as I asked something ordinary, anything to make the moment feel normal again. But the thought wouldn't leave me, is he filming us? We stayed longer than I planned. Longer than I should have. The conversation circled aimlessly, but neither of us made a move to end it. The cafe felt like a bubble outside the rest of the world, one where the things that had already happened didn't have consequences yet. When we finally stood to leave, I felt the man with the phone glance up. Just a flicker of attention, a half-second too long. It made my stomach tighten. Outside, the air was cool, the ground damp underfoot. I told myself not to think about the man inside, not to think about the camera pointed in our direction. We walked to our cars together, our steps in quiet sync. "Funny running into you," I said, the words sounding too light, almost brittle. He gave me a look I couldn't quite read. "Yeah. Funny." I unlocked my car, slid into the driver's seat, and for a moment, just sat there before starting the engine. I watched him walk back to his truck, watched him glance back once before climbing in. As I drove away, the feeling stayed, that something had been captured in that cafe. Not just a moment, but an image. Something permanent in a way that the kiss hadn't been. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was imagining things, letting my nerves run wild. But deep down, the unease lingered, like a shadow that follows you even when the sun disappears. The day after the cafe felt heavier than it should have, as if the sky itself was pressing down on the roof of my house. I kept thinking about that man and the way his phone had been angled, the way his eyes flicked up at us, then back down. Maybe he was just watching something, I told myself. Maybe I was paranoid. But even as I moved through my morning, making breakfast, straightening up the living room, that unease gnawed at me quietly, like a loose thread I couldn't stop pulling. The house felt unusually still, the kind of stillness that amplifies every tiny sound. The drip of the faucet in the kitchen seemed louder, the floor creaked under my own footsteps like it was calling me out. I thought about calling my husband just to hear his voice, but I didn't. I couldn't stand the thought of how normal the conversation would be, how unchanged he sounded, while I carried this knot of worry and guilt in my chest. By late morning, my phone buzzed. Just one short message, "Mind if I stop by?" I stared at the words for a long time. My instinct was to say no, to create some distance, to give both of us a chance to step back and breathe. But instead, my fingers typed 3 simple words that felt heavier than they looked: "That's fine. Come." The hours until he arrived seemed to stretch unnaturally long. I found myself cleaning the kitchen counters for the 3rd time, refluffing pillows on the couch, changing into a different sweater even though the one I had on was perfectly fine. I told myself I was just being a good host, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. When his truck pulled into the driveway, I felt my pulse in my throat. He came to the door with that same easy smile, holding a grocery bag with a few things he'd picked up: milk, bread, a jar of jam. "Figured you might need some," he said casually, like this was the most ordinary visit in the world. I thanked him and let him in. The house changed the moment he crossed the threshold, like the air shifted, like some invisible curtain was drawn back. We settled in the kitchen, where he placed the bag on the counter and leaned against it, looking too at ease, as if he'd been there 100 times before. At first, we talked about the car again. He told me he could come by this weekend to check the battery properly, to make sure I wouldn't get stranded again. The words were practical, but there was something in the way he said them that felt heavier, something unspoken wrapped around each sentence. I made tea, the same kind as before, and we sat at the table. This time, there was no pretense of awkwardness. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't light either. It was charged, the way the air feels just before a storm. When I reached for the sugar jar, my hand brushed his again. It wasn't accidental this time, or if it was, neither of us tried to pretend otherwise. I looked at him, and he looked at me. The house was so quiet that I could hear the tick of the clock on the wall, the faint hum of the refrigerator. And then, without a word, it happened again. We kissed. This one felt different from the first. Not tentative, not startled, but inevitable, like something that had been waiting for its moment. When it ended, we sat there for a beat too long, both of us frozen, as if moving might shatter whatever fragile thing had just settled between us. I pulled back first, my breath catching in my throat. He didn't say anything, just studied my face for a moment, and I could see a question there, one neither of us dared to voice. I busied myself with clearing the cups, needing something to do, some motion to cut through the heaviness. He stood and helped, his hand brushing mine again when he reached for a plate. The rest of his visit passed in a blur. We talked about nothing and everything: the weather, the grocery store, the little repairs around the house. The words barely mattered. When he finally left, the house felt different again. Not lighter, not emptier, just altered, like someone had moved the furniture while I wasn't looking. I stood at the sink, rinsing the cups we'd used, my hand steady but my heart anything but. I told myself again, the same way I had after the first kiss, that this had to stop. But as I stared out the window at the driveway, where his truck had just been, I knew that telling myself wasn't the same as believing it. The second kiss didn't feel like an accident. It felt like a choice. The following days felt like walking across thin ice, the kind that looks solid enough but creaks softly under every step. I moved through the house as if I could somehow keep my balance if I just stayed quiet, stayed careful. But inside, my thoughts were anything but still. The second kiss kept replaying in my head, not in one clean memory, but in flashes. The look on his face right before, the stillness of the air, the way the room felt too warm afterward. It was impossible to tuck it away like some foolish accident. It had felt deliberate, and because of that, everything now felt more dangerous. I tried to return to normal routines. I baked bread one morning, something I hadn't done in months. I weeded the garden until my hands ached. I even called an old friend for a long overdue chat. But none of it dulled the undercurrent of unease. It was a neighbor who broke the thin illusion I'd been building. She stopped by one afternoon, dropping off a basket of herbs from her garden. She stood in my doorway, chatting about the weather, the state of the roads after the rain, all the harmless things neighbors talk about. But then she tilted her head slightly and said, "I think I saw you the other day. At that little cafe on Main. You weren't alone, were you?" Her tone wasn't sharp, not accusing. But the question hung there like a thread pulled too far. I smiled, a little too quickly, and said something about how yes, I'd stopped for coffee, and yes, my nephew had been there. It sounded harmless enough when I said it aloud, but my heart thudded painfully as I watched her face. She didn't push. She just nodded, smiled, and handed me the basket. But the thought sat with me long after she'd gone. People see things. People notice. That evening, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen, expecting another casual message from him, something short like "How was your day?" But it wasn't from him. It was from an unknown number. A short message. No greeting, no name, just 4 words. "Nice coffee the other day." My throat tightened as I stared at it. There was no context, no signature, but I didn't need either to feel the jolt of fear. I reread it over and over, as if another look would make it harmless. It didn't. I didn't reply. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house sounded louder, every vibration of my phone on the nightstand made my stomach twist. I kept imagining that man in the cafe, the one with the phone angled just so. Was it him? Was this his message? The next morning, another text came. "Do you think anyone else saw?" My hands trembled as I set the phone down. The words weren't threatening, not really. They didn't demand anything. But there was something in their simplicity that made my skin crawl. I told myself I was overreacting. That it could be nothing. But the truth was, I didn't believe that. I thought about telling my husband, not the whole truth, but some part of it. Maybe I could frame it as someone bothering me, some stranger sending odd messages. But the idea of opening that door, even a crack, terrified me. Instead, I stayed silent. He called that evening, his voice the same steady tone as always, talking about work, about when he'd be home. I answered his questions, kept my voice light, and hoped he couldn't hear the strain in it. When I hung up, I stared at the phone for a long time. The house felt different now. Not just quiet, watched. Even when I knew I was alone, I felt eyes on me. Later that night, I got another message. A single image. It was grainy, slightly blurred, but unmistakable. Me and my nephew in the cafe. Not close enough to see too much, but enough to see us sitting across from each other, leaning in a little too close. I dropped the phone on the table like it had burned me. For a long time, I didn't move. The picture sat there on the screen, its edges glowing faintly in the dim room, and I understood for the first time how quickly something private could become something else entirely. I deleted the photo. I deleted the messages. But it didn't matter. Because the image wasn't just on my phone now. It was in my head. The day after that photo arrived, I woke to the sound of rain tapping against the windows. It should have been comforting, but instead it felt like the sky itself was reminding me how trapped I was. I stayed in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, trying to force my mind to go blank. But my thoughts kept circling back to the same thing, the image, the messages, the undeniable feeling that someone out there was watching. By mid-morning, my phone rang. It wasn't the unknown number. It was him. He didn't ask how I was or dance around his reason for calling. His voice was low, direct. "I need help," he said. "My truck broke down. I'm out near the highway." For a moment, I thought about telling him to call someone else. A tow truck, a friend, anyone. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself already pulling on my coat, already reaching for my keys. The rain was heavier as I drove, the kind that blurred the world into streaks of gray and silver. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than they needed to, my knuckles pale in the dim light. When I saw his truck on the side of the road, I slowed, pulling over behind it. He was standing by the hood, rain soaking his jacket, the kind of sight that should have looked ordinary but didn't. I rolled down the window just enough to call out, "You okay?" He gave me a half-smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It won't start. I think the alternator's gone." I killed the engine and got out, the rain soaking through my shoes within seconds. We stood there, side by side, staring at the open hood like it might fix itself if we just looked long enough. "Any chance of a tow truck tonight?" I asked, though we both already knew the answer. He shook his head. "Not for hours." And with this weather, he glanced around at the near-empty road, the distant shapes of trucks barreling past. "It's not safe to wait here." We stood in silence for a moment, the rain filling the spaces where words should have been. "There's an inn a few miles up," he said finally. "We could wait it out there." I should have hesitated. I should have said no. But I didn't. We left his truck on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking like a warning neither of us wanted to heed, and got back into my car. The ride to the inn was quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful but heavy, like the air before a confession. The inn was small, the kind of place travelers choose only out of necessity. The sign out front flickered, half the letters burned out. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of damp carpet and coffee that had been sitting too long. The clerk didn't ask questions. Just slid a key across the counter. One room. The room itself was simple, a bed, a chair by the window, a desk with a lamp that flickered when we turned it on. The rain outside drummed against the roof, steady and unrelenting. We stood there for a moment, both of us dripping water onto the thin carpet, neither sure what to do next. I told myself this was practical. That we were just waiting out the storm. That this was about safety, about the rain, about his broken truck. But the truth was quieter, harder to ignore. The walls of the room seemed to close in, the air thick with things unspoken. And there, in that narrow space between denial and admission, we spent the night together. When morning came, the rain had stopped, but the world outside looked washed out, pale under the early light. We didn't speak much as we left the inn. We checked out, drove back to his truck, called the tow company. Each step was practical, almost mechanical, as if saying too much might crack the fragile quiet we'd wrapped around ourselves. But the silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was full of what we'd done, full of what we both now carried, and full of the unspoken knowledge that there was no going back. The drive back from the inn was strangely quiet, not because we had nothing to say but because the weight of everything we didn't say filled the car like a thick fog. The rain had cleared, leaving the road slick and reflective, the sunlight breaking weakly through a pale sky. The windshield wipers squeaked against the damp glass once, twice, and then I switched them off, but the silence that followed felt even louder. We didn't look at each other much on the way back. He stared out the window, one hand resting on his knee, the other on the door handle like he was ready to open it at any second. I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than I needed to, my fingers stiff on the leather. My heart felt like it was beating in two different rhythms, one for the life I had lived until now, and one for whatever had just begun. When we reached his truck, it was still there, sitting like a stranded animal on the side of the road, hazard lights blinking faintly in the daylight. We stood for a moment by the hood, the awkwardness between us sharp enough to feel physical. He called for a tow, his voice steady, practical, like any of this could be made normal with enough calm words. I drove him back to his house after we left the truck behind. He thanked me when we pulled into his driveway, but neither of us lingered. He didn't ask if he could come by later, and I didn't offer. By the time I pulled into my own driveway, the weight of the night before had sunk into me so deeply I could feel it in my bones. I turned off the engine and sat there, staring at the front door. My husband's car wasn't there, of course it wasn't. He was still away. But I felt like if I stepped inside, the walls of the house would know anyway. When I finally did go in, the house was too quiet. Not the comforting quiet of solitude, but the sharp, listening quiet of a room after an argument you haven't had yet. I hung up my coat and stood there in the hallway, unsure what to do. The weight of guilt sat heavy, but guilt wasn't the only thing there. There was also the memory, the undeniable fact that last night had happened, and that it couldn't be undone. I went through the motions anyway. I started a load of laundry. I wiped down the kitchen counters even though they didn't need it. I brewed tea, even though I didn't really want any. I just needed to keep moving, to keep from sitting still long enough to let my thoughts catch up. But thoughts have a way of catching you no matter how hard you try to outrun them. That afternoon, my husband called. His voice was warm but tired, like it always was when he'd been working long days. He talked about meetings, about the people he'd had dinner with, about when he thought he'd be coming home. I answered all his questions, my voice too light, almost cheerful. It felt like I was acting in a play I hadn't rehearsed for, every line improvised but too perfect, too careful. After we hung up, I stared at my phone for a long time, wishing for the first time in years that I could tell him something real. I wanted to say I was lonely. I wanted to say I missed feeling close to him, the kind of closeness that wasn't about schedules and errands and polite kisses before bed. But instead, I said nothing. That night, I barely slept. The house felt even more hollow in the dark. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like footsteps, every gust of wind against the window like someone knocking. When morning came, I found myself staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. My face looked the same, but I didn't feel the same. There was a shadow in my own eyes I hadn't noticed before. Later that day, another message came from the unknown number. Did you have a good night? No context. No signature. Just that. I dropped the phone onto the table as if it burned me, the screen glowing up at me like an accusation. I didn't answer. But even as I turned the phone face down, I knew that whoever was on the other end wasn't finished. And neither was the story I was now tangled in. The next few days felt like I was living with a weight pressed against my chest, a pressure I couldn't shake no matter how I tried to distract myself. The house looked the same, the routines were the same, but everything inside me had shifted. Even the way I moved felt different, like I was constantly adjusting for something that no one else could see. The messages didn't stop. At first, they came once a day. Short, vague lines that felt like whispers from a shadow. Did you sleep well? Nice choice of cafe. What would your husband think? None of them were explicitly cruel, but that made them worse. Their simplicity left too much room for me to fill in the blanks. I kept deleting them, but every time I pressed delete, the hollow feeling grew. Because deleting the messages didn't erase the fact that someone had seen us. Someone had proof. I tried to convince myself that maybe the messages would just stop on their own. That whoever was sending them would get bored, move on, leave us alone. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I thought about telling him. Not my husband, him. The one person who understood what this really meant. But every time I picked up my phone, I froze. What would I say? I think someone knows? I think someone has pictures of us? It sounded absurd when I imagined the words, like something that couldn't possibly be real. By the third day, the tension had started to eat at me. I jumped when the phone rang, even if it was just a telemarketer. Every car that slowed near the house made me glance out the window. I even started locking the door behind me when I went to the garden, as if that flimsy twist of a lock could keep out whatever had already gotten in. My husband called one evening, his voice warm and steady, completely unaware. He asked if I'd been eating well, if I'd had any trouble with the car, if I'd remembered to water the plants in the back. I answered like nothing was wrong. I made my voice calm, made my words light. I could almost believe the performance myself if not for the tightening in my throat when he said, "I miss you." I missed him, too, in a way that made my chest ache. But I also knew that the version of me he missed wasn't the version who now lived in this house. That night, another message came. Wouldn't it be easier to just tell him? I stared at those words, my fingers gripping the phone so tightly they hurt. I didn't reply. The next day, I couldn't take the silence anymore. I called him, not my husband, but the one who was tangled in this mess with me. When he picked up, his voice was cautious. "Is everything okay?" I wanted to say yes, to pretend it was just a casual call, but the words slipped out before I could stop them. "Someone's messaging me." There was a pause, sharp and heavy. "What do you mean?" "They sent a picture," I said quietly, the image of us at that cafe flashing again in my mind. "They know." He didn't speak for a moment. When he did, his voice was low, tight. "I'll come over." I should have told him not to. I should have said there was no point. But I didn't. When he arrived, the house felt too small for both of us. He stood in the kitchen, looking at my phone on the counter, the screen dark now but holding all the weight of those messages. "Did they say what they want?" he asked. I shook my head. "Just comments. Questions." He frowned, pacing a little, his hands on his hips. "It could be nothing. Someone just messing around." But we both knew it didn't feel like nothing. The conversation circled, but we didn't find answers. After he left, I stood in the doorway, watching his truck pull away. The driveway felt emptier than it had before he came, and yet the air inside the house still felt thick, like his presence hadn't fully left. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The room was dark, but my thoughts weren't. I thought about my husband's voice on the phone, about the way he trusted me without even thinking to question. I thought about the photo, about the unknown number, about the fact that someone somewhere had a piece of my life in their hands. I thought about choices, the ones I'd made, and the ones I hadn't yet. And for the first time since all of this began, I wondered if there was any way out that didn't destroy everything. The morning after that sleepless night felt different, though I couldn't quite explain why. The air in the house seemed lighter somehow, as if the storm that had been hanging over me for weeks had shifted just slightly. I moved through the kitchen on autopilot, boiling water for tea, staring at the same chipped mug I'd used for years, my mind caught in that strange haze between dread and relief. When I reached for my phone, my stomach tightened the way it always did now. Every morning had become a small ritual of fear, picking up the device, bracing myself for whatever would be waiting on the screen. But this time, there was nothing. No new messages. No blurred images. No cryptic comments. I refreshed my inbox, checked again, even scrolled back through the old texts as if they might have disappeared too, but they were still there. Just no new ones. I told myself not to read into it. One day without a message didn't mean anything. But as the hours passed, the silence felt heavier, not lighter. By afternoon, curiosity gave way to unease. I checked again, and again, still nothing. It wasn't until evening that I realized what had changed. The unknown number was gone. Not just muted, not just quiet. Deleted. Every message, every picture, every fragment of the connection had vanished, like it had never existed. I stared at the empty screen, my reflection faint in the dark glass. Part of me should have felt relieved. But instead, I felt hollow. Because the messages had been awful, terrifying in their own way, but they had been something to focus on, a thread that tied the chaos together. Now that thread was gone, and all that remained was the reality of what I'd done. My husband called that night. His voice was the same as always, warm, distracted, steady. He told me he'd be home soon. That he was looking forward to seeing me. That he'd bring my favorite flowers from the little shop near the station. I said all the right things in return, my voice steady, my words practiced. But inside, my thoughts were louder than my voice. What would he see when he looked at me? Would he notice the weight I carried now, the quiet guilt that had seeped into everything I touched? I hung up the phone and sat in the kitchen long after the tea had gone cold. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet it had been weeks ago. Back then, the quiet had been lonely, sharp. Now it was heavy, thick with all the words I'd never say. I thought about my nephew, about the look on his face the last time he'd been here. The way his truck had disappeared down the street, leaving the air behind it unsettled. He hadn't messaged me since that night. I hadn't messaged him either. There was nothing left to say, not without pulling at threads that would unravel everything. I stood by the window as the last bit of daylight faded, the sky deepening into a muted blue. I looked out at the driveway, at the garden, at the stillness of the street. For a moment, I almost believed I could pretend. Pretend none of it had happened. Pretend the messages hadn't come. Pretend the kisses, the night in the inn, the weight of those choices could be folded neatly into a box and stored somewhere I'd never have to open again. But pretending wasn't the same as forgetting. I knew that when my husband walked through the door, when he set down his suitcase and smiled at me the way he always had, I would smile back. I would ask about his trip. I would thank him for the flowers. And he might never know. But I would. I picked up my phone one last time that night. There were no messages, no traces of the number that had haunted me for weeks. I hovered over his contact, not my husband's, but his. And then, slowly, I deleted it. The name disappeared from the screen, the thread of our messages gone in an instant. But the weight didn't leave with it. Because some things don't vanish when you press delete. Some things stay. I turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dark for a long moment, letting my eyes adjust. The house was silent again. But now, the silence would always have an echo.
Bye bye.